That was easy.
From an outside perspective, Sega systems generally aren't known for being RPG powerhouses, being mostly known for their arcade output or Sonic the Hedgehog. That's a shame because Sega made some especially great JRPGs themselves. Today we're looking at what I would consider their swan song on their final home console, or at least the later GameCube port of it, Skies of Arcadia Legends. Skies of Arcadia follows Vyse, an upcoming sky pirate flying under his father's banner together with a girl named Aika. During their raid on a Valiant ship, they rescue a young girl named Fina. No, not that Fina. No, the other one. Yeah, there we go. Fina came from a long-lost civilization up in the sky and was sent down to gather special crystals needed to stop the end of the world from happening. But Fina wasn't the only one who came down from the Silver Civilization. Someone else had come down before her. Ramirez. For one reason or another, he wound up abandoning his duty and joining the Valiant Armada, helping Valio's army take totalitarian control over the skies instead. It's not the most complex story by any means, and it won't win any awards for originality in broader strokes. In fact, very large elements of the main plotline were quite clearly taken over from Final Fantasy VII. The young girl tied to an ancient civilization, the super soldier abandoning his beliefs trying to cause as much damage as he can out of spite, an overbearing army attempting to take control of the rest of the world from a walled-off town divided by upper and lower class areas. Areas that are connected with a train that you board by jumping on top of it and have to run to the back to avoid security of. Kaiju-sized weapons wreaking havoc on the world. And this is just in the early game. There's still so much more that takes after Final Fantasy VII that we would be here forever if we really listed everything. But you know what? None of this is criticism, because Skies of Arcadia takes all of these elements and makes something of its own out of them. It's a game that flies its inspirations proudly without blindly repeating them. Because where Final Fantasy VII is a gloomy game about an existential crisis, Skies of Arcadia is an upbeat and cheerful game about a cool guy who doesn't give up in the face of adversity. Even replaying it so many years displaced from its initial release, Vyse still feels like a breath of fresh air. He's pretty atypical as a JRPG protagonist. Not only are both of his parents still alive, they're actually supportive of him going out there and making a name for himself. Vyse doesn't doubt what he wants to do with himself or if he's on the right track, and sure, his hometown does get burnt down to the ground early on, but it's quickly rebuilt by a strong community that bounces back from adversity themselves. This sort of thing is a rarity. Vyse and Aika are active at driving the plot forward, always thinking of ways to solve problems and taking all the chances they see to get ahead. It fits the theming of being good guy pirates, since you have to be a bit of a rogue to get anywhere if you operate outside of the law. Especially if you're still operating with a solid moral compass, only stealing from a corrupt army or old ruins. Their active pursuits really helps the narrative moving ahead at all times, since they're not just on this quest because they have to be. They decided to help Fina on her journey because it's a good excuse to see the wider world out there and make a name for themselves. That it also means that they're doing a good thing just means they hit two birds with one stone. Their nature also means that every hour you're facing a new major issue to resolve. One moment you're stopping your dad from being beheaded. The next you're firing cannons while trying to escape through a closing gate in a ship you're a guest on. There's a steady stream of change in scenery and scale. So instead of going for the big problems immediately, you're always tackling smaller problems one by one leading up to the bigger issues at hand. JRPGs often have this scale problem, where the scope has to continuously increase, so every new story beat has to be bigger than the last to outdo it. Skies of Arcadia instead has a tendency to reset the scale and build it back up for major arcs. So if the story leads you to go somewhere, it usually starts with the question of how to even get there. And when you do finally make it there, you have to get yourself adjusted to the surroundings. And then after that, you can start searching for the major dungeon that you're supposed to find here. A lot of these steps before the big dungeon also come with their own conflicts, dungeons, bosses, and objectives before the main one even starts. So instead of the traditional format of going to a new town, then diving into the dungeon to solve the problems there, you have this increased scope to a larger series of events involved with the dungeon. And often enough, things still aren't quite resolved once the dungeon itself is cleared. It gives this game a much less stilted flow than a lot of older RPGs. So let's talk about what you usually end up doing in the dungeons: fighting enemies. Skies of Arcadia has some very interesting combat going on. At first, it seems very straightforward and barely worth examining more deeply. You have a typical full turn system where you pick your entire team's moves and then the turn plays out until everyone's had their go, with the character stats deciding the turn order. So far, pretty standard stuff. Where it gets interesting is that the entire party shares a spirit points meter. Every special ability costs spirit points to use, and characters can give up their turn to charge up more spirit instead. At the start of every turn, you get a certain amount of spirit passively, but sometimes you just need that extra bit more if you want to keep using those big abilities consistently. Now in most games, you'd assume that this replaces MP, but that's actually not the case here. Magic is separate from skills and costs MP to use. Skills are all unique to the characters, while the spells are all global for the entire party. Also, the max MP is fairly low compared to most JRPGs, so menu healing with spells is discouraged more aggressively than usual. And while in combat, spells not only cost MP, they still cost SP too. In turn, this gives you a much bigger reason to actually use items than most games, which is interesting. I'm pretty much used to items barely having any use except for tossing the odd ether at the white mage to help them heal the party from the menu between battles. Items are also very cheap to stock up on in bulk, so the developers definitely wanted you to be using them more aggressively than most RPGs. Spells are learned from elemental experience. Every weapon can be changed to an element at any given time, allowing you to freely switch to the most advantageous type of physical damage output at any time. And the more you use a certain color on any character, the more spells they'll unlock for the associated element over time. As a result, I rarely ended up using spells outside of casting Increm to increase Vyse's damage during most of the game, and even then I was more likely to have Aika cast it since she usually moves first, giving her a better chance to cast it before Vyse goes in with a Cutlass Fury or a Pirate's Wrath. I think Fina's supposed to be the dedicated caster and healer, but considering you usually want your heals to go as fast as possible, it makes more sense to me to use Aika that way. Also, with Aika going first and her skills all being nukes, she's pretty good at cleaning up the weaker encounters faster than fighting against them normally. Something I'd never thought of to do back in the day was to try and see how hard status effects can mess with the big fights, including bosses, and as a result, I've discovered that Fina's first skill is stupidly useful. I've kept bosses petrified in place during entire fights abusing it, it's great. Still not anywhere near as broken as Vyse's late game damage output, but definitely up there. Also, a minor detail that I quite like is how characters will move like they're attacking and dodging outside of their turns, giving you the sense that the characters are still actively engaging in combat in the background, instead of everyone just standing still outside of their turns the way that they do in normal RPGs. It's the tiny details that really make a difference, and tiny details is something that Skies of Arcadia is full of. The towns feel like they have so much going on in them. Even if most of them are pretty small by modern standards, they feel actually full and lived in, with all these details and unique character models that must have been a pain to get working back in those days. Since they were still doing all the character animations by hand, motion capture and most automated shortcuts weren't around when this was made, which makes all those uniquely modeled vendors all the more impressive in how expressive they are. The detail doesn't just go to the character models and town structures either. Skies of Arcadia, being a game about sky pirates, has its entire overworld take place in flying ships. This is something that could have easily gone wrong, since the airship is usually the last thing that you get in most JRPGs, giving you that sense of total freedom once you reach the endgame. But the map design in Skies of Arcadia still does a good job of giving you actual limitations without feeling too restrictive. Even early on, when there isn't much you can do against the stone reefs or air currents, it still feels like there's this big open world out there for you to explore. And a good chunk of this feeling that there is stuff to explore is because there is. There's discoveries to be made. Discoveries are special locations on the map that reward you with some fanfare and give you a bit more of the world's lore when you find them. Not only that, but all the major ports across the skies have a Sailor's Guild. These places are dying for more information on some of the unique sites that the world has to offer, making you feel like quite the explorer for actually investigating all these areas that look like something could be there. You can also buy hints towards the discoveries that they already know about, inviting the sense of virtual tourism with loose directions to these locations. To me, this feels like a nod to the first Grandia, with its safer, commercialized idea of adventuring promoted by the guild. It doesn't use this system arbitrarily either. Several of the major story points lead to discoveries too, so finding discoveries isn't some weird hobby that the characters do on the side that nobody comments on. It's part of Vyse's duty as a sky pirate to go and explore the world like this. So it's only natural that the world rewards you for it, and the game makes it a part of its narrative. And as you explore, find discoveries, fight enemies, and make the right dialogue options, your swashbuckling rank increases. Now, I have to admit, it is a complete coincidence that I'm reviewing this so soon after Sakura Taisen, because I had no idea that people from Sakura Taisen had worked on this game, but one of the designers behind that game, Shuntaro Tanaka, helped direct Skies of Arcadia, and some of the influences from Sakura ended up making its way into Skies. So just like Captain Ogami of the Hanagumi, Vyse is expected to pick the dialogue options that encourage the people around him, like a good captain would. If you'd like to know more about this sort of thing, there's a great interview with both Shuntaro Tanaka and Hideyako Kamada of Phantasy Star and Seventh Dragon fame on the Shmuplations channel. This interview also reassured my belief that the sense of freedom and skill that the game presents was because the Dreamcast was the first real 3D system that the developers had worked on. So they themselves felt liberated from previous hardware limitations working on this game. Also, all the weapons being transparent was a flex because neither the Genesis or the Saturn could handle transparency all that well. It is really fun stuff to be aware of.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill.
So, let's talk about the other combat. Skies of Arcadia has two combat systems. You've got the traditional combat system, but you've also got the ship combat. During ship combat, you and your party members all pick who will do what on a grid determining what turn they'll do these actions on, and then all of these actions take place. It looks and sounds very complex at first, but it's not really. You've still got access to the same spirit point system, though this time all forms of attacks take up points too. So you have to manage SP in a way that allows you to fire on turns where the enemy is vulnerable, shown with a cannon marker, while trying to evade on the turns that the enemy is primed to attack, shown with yellow or red turn markers. The cannon marker and the colored squares can overlap as well. Your main firing options consists of cannons that fire the turn they're fired in, torpedoes that will come down at a later turn, and smaller guns that will fire across several turns. Later on, you also get the big damage miracle attacks, at which point a lot of the combat kind of just devolves into waiting for the turns where you can fire that.
Harpoon cannon, fire!
Now, I'm going to be honest here, I didn't really like the ship combat all that much replaying this game. I remember loving it when I was younger, but replaying it now it felt excruciatingly sluggish. And there's three major reasons for that. The first is that with how turn order works in this style of combat, you pick your next 4 turns of combat and then have to wait a very long time for all of it to finish. It feels less bad when you have a group of 4 party members attacking separately from each other against a larger group of enemies. It still feels like things are happening then, but during a one-on-one fight, you're inputting a batch of commands before being allowed to go on a long break since nothing is happening for a while. The second issue, and this heavily relates back to the first, is that there is a lot of dead air between the attack confirmations. It's not even the animations of the attacks that take long, though they take long too. There is a very long time between these attacks while we get repeated establishing shots of the two combatants kind of just lazing around before acting. I think if you'd cut this wasted time down, the first issue wouldn't feel anywhere near as bad as that it does now. The third issue is that most of the fights you're just kinda waiting for a narrative win button.
Moonstone Cannon, fire!
Early on, it's the Harpoon Cannon, later on, it's the Moonstone Cannon. Whenever the game decides that you can fire this, usually after a narrative beat, you've usually won. Though later on you have to fire it more than once, but it's still kinda the same. It's a shame because I think they're onto something here, and for as many grievances as I have with the ship combat, I appreciate its existence because it breaks things up and adds variety to the game. It's very nice to have two combat modes, so you're not always doing the exact same thing, and I get that asking for a more involved form of ship combat would be way too much to ask for a game of this era, but even then, most of the things that the game does would be too much to ask from any developers of this era anyway. Like the way that Skies of Arcadia uses its music.
Move! Give me strength!
You know how Metal Gear Rising, Revengeance, and Nier Automata are often celebrated because of how they handle their music that dynamically changes depending on certain factors? Well, Skies of Arcadia already did this on the Dreamcast somehow.
Cutlass Fury!
Move! Give me strength!
During boss fights, there's 3 main boss fight theme variations, each with their own arrangements to lead into one another. There's a neutral boss theme, a boss theme for when you're doing bad, and a boss theme for when you're winning. Which one plays is based on the health of your party and that of the boss that you're fighting. If one of your party members dies, you're sure to get the bad track. If the boss is under half of their HP, you get the good track. The overworld operates on a similar theme, with different backing instrumentation popping up depending on what area you're flying through. It's very good stuff. The music in general is, though I'm kind of presenting a lie in this video. For most of this video, I've been playing the Dreamcast version of the soundtrack, and the GameCube's version is a massive downgrade. Apparently it has to do with how the sound was originally handled by the sound engine, which I guess also helped with the dynamic adjusting of music. When the game was ported to the GameCube, they supposedly switched sound engines, and because of that, a lot of the special properties of the instruments was lost. To add to this, emulation can do a number on it too, since anytime there's some sort of performance stutter or there are too many sounds going on, parts of the music disappears, almost like an NES game. It's a shame, but it's not something that destroys the experience of the game or anything. I've seen footage of the Dreamcast version emulated while trying to find certain discoveries, and it looked a lot worse than any issue I was coming across on Dolphin. Dolphin just had the odd stutter here or there, and some visual glitches on scene transitions that would usually disappear as soon as the new scene was in place. Nothing catastrophic. It might run better for other people on better PCs, especially since they're also not taxing their system recording the session like I was. It's hard to say. So, Why the GameCube version despite the lesser sound? Because of two major reasons. For one, Skies of Arcadia Legends has a better encounter rate with readjusted experience gain values. I played a bit of the Dreamcast version back in the day since I was one of the lucky few to hear how terrifyingly close to dying the disk drive sounds at all times. Not only is the encounter rate much worse in that version, it has some very bad loading times before every battle as well. Skies of Arcadia still became one of the most beloved Dreamcast titles under these circumstances, and it's still very much deserved. But you really come to appreciate how much better off you are when you're not dealing with these load times or encounter rates. On top of that, there's some new content. The Sailors Guild has some bounty posters up, leading you to some evil pirates that you can track down and fight. Defeating them nets you some extra gold. A lot of these encounters also add a fair bit to the setting, even if they're pretty minor. But the evil cloud-stealing Vyse encounter is something that I don't want to consider Skies of Arcadia without anymore. Then there's Piastel, the Angel of Death, where you have to defeat a bounty hunter chasing Vyse several times through the course of the game. Her quest is also linked to another side quest, the Moonfish. Moonfish are collectibles that make a special noise when you're in the right spot, prompting you to go into first-person mode and catch them. These moonfish are then delivered to a doctor outside of the Central Sailor's Island. Here you feed a weird hamster duck thing that spits out items for you to keep as a reward. Feeding it enough, the doctor will tell you some more of the history of Ramirez's arrival in Valua, and what led to him becoming the person that you see in the game now. There's also some new discoveries, though I couldn't tell you which ones are new, to be honest. Skies of Arcadia wasn't exactly lacking in content or collectibles before the additions on the GameCube port, but there's still things that add a little bit of extra variety to the game, and I always like minor collectibles like Moonfish in RPGs, like the red crystals in Illusion of Gaia, so all these bonuses are welcome additions to me. Beyond the discoveries and Moonfish, there's more to collect that was already there in the base Dreamcast game. You have Cham, special items that are invisible until you get near them. Fina's weapon, Cupel, points you to them, giving you a prompt to pick them up when you're close enough. These items are the only way for Fina to gain new weapons, as Cupel can change his shape into new weapons over time. It's a nice way to ensure that a character has a unique weapon that stays unique, instead of having their unique weapons on sale in every shop in the world. And then on top of all of this, you also get the ability to assemble a crew in the second half of the game. Quite like Suikoden, you become the leader of your own crew and establish a base of your own. So every town has at least someone new that's willing to join you in your fight and establish a place for themselves at your home base. A base that you can also upgrade and slightly customize. These might be a lot of extra diversions, but they're all happening at the same time, while the game keeps moving the plot at a steady pace. So even in the moment-to-moment, you're still discovering and finding things on your own. It all adds up to a really satisfying game to play. It's a shame that there's no modern re-release of Skies of Arcadia. Despite there being fan demand, and the old director clearly wanting to see it happen too, it's hard to know what's actually up with these kinds of things, so it's a shame nothing has happened since the GameCube release many moons ago. Though that's not entirely true, is it? Vyse did appear as an unlockable in Sonic Racing Transformed, along with other long-lost Sega characters like Samba de Amigo, Joe Musashi, The Pyro, and Jafar. Vyse, Aika, and Fina also show up in Valkyria Chronicles, a game that Shuntaro Tanaka also had a hand in. Also, yeah, I know it's not Fina, but her twin daughters or something like that, but that's clearly her design, so I'm counting it. So, do I recommend Skies of Arcadia? Yeah. This is one of those games I was always afraid of going back to, wondering if maybe playing it when I was young made me look at it with rose-tinted glasses. That replaying it years later would have me return to something not quite up to the standards of my memories. And while that is kind of true for the ship battles, every other part of the game is such a well-oiled machine that I can't help but appreciate it even more than before. If you've been on the fence about trying out Skies of Arcadia, I highly recommend giving it a spin. It works well enough on Dolphin, and it's still one of the greatest of its time. Speaking of the greatest, I asked one of the greatest questions of all time on Patreon for this game's poll. What matters more in a game? Quality of life or hometown. I mean, quality of life and content, or quality of original assets. Well, this one tits up. Not a single vote for polishing the original assets. Every single vote went towards quality of life and additional content. There are some cases where I would personally disagree, where lowering the quality of the music or taking away the visual presentation would rob the experience of its strengths. Dragon Quest XI comes to mind for me. But in almost all cases, yeah, I feel pretty much the same way. Anyway, the next video, we're going on a sugar rush as we fall into a food coma. It'll be up in a flash. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now and vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will, see ya.